Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Toshiko Mori. I'm an architect practicing in New York City, and also I teach at Harvard GSD in a Department of Architecture. And I welcome you tonight for a discussion on dialogue on details. And as some of you may know, I have an exhibition here in Central Pavilion titled Tsien, Dialogue on Details. And I will make a premise about that, but before that I'd like to introduce to you the speakers in this panel. This is a very informal discussion among architects, and I feel like details is a common ground of many of us that work in different places, in different scales, in different styles, and different ideas about architecture. The first person is Wang from Hangzhou, China, and he established amateur architecture with his partner when you over there, I wanted her to be recognized. And he's the head of architecture of Hangzhou's China Art Academy. And Billie, Tsien and Todd Williams practice in New York City. And I must say that their installation in Arsenale, at the very end of Arsenale, is a very beautiful gardener storage cottage. And you really must see it. It's a most evocative piece of information here in Biennale. And I must say that Todd was my professor at Cooper Union. He instilled in me importance of detail, so I owe teaching. And Raymund, he's a curator of Heinz Architectural Center in Carnegie Museum of Pittsburgh, New York. He's also a prolific writer and a critic in magazines. He contributes to magazines and books. Vittorio Lampugnani, he's a professor of history of urban design at ETH Zurich, also the head of Institute of History and Theory at ETH, and he has a practice, architectural practice in Milan and Zurich, and you probably have seen his installation as a master planner for Novartis campus in Basel in Arsenale. And David Chipperfield, the commissioner of a Biennale, no introduction needed, the most famous person in this particular common ground we share today. I just like to read a short paragraph about Carlos Scarpa because my installation ideas for details is a tribute to Scarpa. It's from Carlos Scarpa, Architecture and Details, from Bianca Albertini and Sandro Bagnoli. A fundamental inquiry into any aspect of reality is a relationship between the part and the whole, the fragment and the complete, the detail and the indivisible unity of a deed, of an object, of a thought. Disciplines with scrupulous foundations exhaustively developed from the 19th century onward, for example, paleontology, are based on the deduction of organic forms from fragments preserved through the centuries. But this inquiry has not been answered conclusively. On the contrary, it dichotomizes current critical thought, oscillation without certitude between acceptance of a reality characterized by the dissipation of energies and the hope of a balanced, plausible unity, albeit with the inevitable fragmentation of existence and experience. It is an investigation particularly central to every kind of artistic production, although only implicit in the vast majority of cases. The accuracy and validity of the interpretation of profound issues relating to individual figures, geographical areas, or specific periods in the history of art often are predicated upon a possible solution. Architectural production of indisputed values, such as Carlos Scarpa's, is endowed with potent imagery and evocative, incisive drawings. Work like Scarpa's characterized by the project, each a compact and complete unit, richly filled with scholarly references. So with this quote as an inspiration, I like to be asking panels different questions, but I think the first person I really like to ask, and I thank David Chipperfield very much for joining this panel among these busy schedules. And if you have some thoughts about issues of detail, I'd appreciate it very much.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you refer to Scarpa because in a way, I see Scarpa as both a hero and a villain. I know it's not fashionable to say such a thing, but Scarpa, in his works, one can't fault. Although there is a certain fetishism in, the way he uses details. But in my opinion, it's saved by the craftsmanship and the way these things, the intelligence and the purposefulness about these interventions. But Vittorio is probably going to correct me on this, but it seemed to me that Scarpa then opened the door, literally, for another generation to hide behind details. I mean, Italy became full of very mediocre projects that did nothing at the bigger scale. They were really awful buildings, but they were full of details, and nice little handrails and some polished Venetian walls, and it became a little bit of, it's a problem when the detail is not supportive of an idea or of a philosophy or a strategy. So I would actually throw another grenade into this conversation, which is a sort of skepticism about detail. And also I would say in the case of restoration and conservation and the meeting of old and new in terms of architecture, which again Scarpa made a fantastic contribution to, but again it became a little bit fetishized that the differences, you articulate differences, you articulate junctions, you articulate the meetings of things. And again, I think that modern architecture became slightly obsessed, in the absence of knowing what to express, it often ended up expressing differences, solid and transparent, light and heavy, rough and smooth. These are all things which they are the words of our books. These are things which we all must, they are the tools. But when they become, it's as if, there's certain writers that they craft the sentences so beautifully that you're so seduced, but then after about 3 chapters you get so irritated, the phrases are so beautiful, and then something else takes over, a sort of irritation that this is too beautiful and it's not real enough. And I do think that there's an issue in terms of discussing detail where, and if you, in the context of Scarpa, and I would say in the context of Italy, that there was a sort of hidden danger there as well. That, it gets very close to sort of, it can be mannerist, easily it can be mannerist, because it's, sometimes you have the feeling it's a detail looking for a home, and it can become a sort of camouflage of a lack of project. I think that the details you're showing in the Central Pavilion come from another way. They are the way by which an idea is resolved. And then, in a way, of course, the detail is important. But in another way, it's not the detail that's important. It's the fact that the detail just supports and makes sure that the idea happens.
I absolutely agree with the fact that the details, or let's say the Scarpa tendency, is a very dangerous tendency, because it has a tendency of making details autonomous, a value in themselves, and I think that every detail, of course I'm interested in details in architecture, but they should be aimed at translating and transporting a concept. If they don't do that, it's not worth. I would even go further. I would even say, although I am interested in detail, that the test for a good architecture is that it should bear having bad details. There's some work by, not all, but some work by Aldo Rossi, for instance, his cemetery in San Cataldo. If you look at the detailing, it's quite appalling. But it's a wonderful piece of architecture. It's so strong that you really don't care if the concrete is rough and has obviously not the quality of, I don't know, Tadawando's concrete, because the idea, the tectonic, the forms are so strong that they are good. There is, about the details, sometimes I think that there is an analogy to a kind of test that an important writer and architectural amateur in the Italy of the 30s suggested, Massimo Bontempelli. He did it for literature, and he edited a magazine that was called Novecento, and this magazine was published in Italian or in French, and he tended to translate texts, so to translate them into French or into Italian, depending what the original was, assuming or sustaining that a good text must stand the translation. So the translation takes away, the elegance of a formula, the elegance of a choice of a word, and it's crude somehow, often. But I think that this test of crudeness is something that we can use in architecture, and it's true at the level of the object, and it's probably even more true at the level of urban planning, where sometimes we do really crude master plans because we think they need to be so strong to sustain very different and also very very contradictory architectures.
I think it's very interesting to talk about details, talk about color scarpa, because I think the details for me is not just about details. Because if you talk about details, in fact, you talk about architectural language. The real language is composed by details. It's very important. Usually we talk something, it's like that. If you talk about details, it's when you talk something, you separate two persons. One person to talk, and another person to see you, and to check what you see, what your structure of the language, what your details, how to choose the word from one word to another. So, for example, I use the recycled material. It's not just the materials. It's also about the language and details, because the recycled materials, you need some craftsman skills to construct the bricks, tiles. It's not just about construction, it's about the details. It's about the language, it's about the taste. It's about the basic tone. So usually when we design something, for me it's very difficult, usually in the beginning, because I should find the spatial tone, like the singer. If I find the tone, everything becomes easy. If I can't find tone this time, it's very hard time, very difficult time. Maybe 1 month, 2 months, I'm looking for what's the feeling, right? On another side, I think for Carlos Scarpa, I liked it very much. Even today, I see his small pavilion here, and I see in the wall they have a corner. They have 6 or 7 small triangle. It's separate to the rough concrete to small concrete. They have the separate. And suddenly I found, it's good details, because he used the small things, destroy the feeling about the weight. The concrete is very heavy, but he used the small details, destroy this feeling, become less concrete, become very light. Oh, it's so amazing. Suddenly they touch my heart. I think it means details. For colors, of course, Carlos Scarpa's way is very dangerous. Its details a little bit has a feeling about decoration, but he can control it. He's the master. But if another people use this way, very dangerous, they go into the boiling way. Yeah, so it's not just about theory, it's about the skills. Yeah, basically, if you're a writer, you need the skills, I think.
for those of you who haven't seen it, we sent out 35 boxes to people who we felt a kind of kinship with. And we asked them to fill the boxes with things that had nothing to do with their architectural practice, if they were indeed architects. Some of them were actually artists, writers, our cabinet maker, and indeed our son and his business partner. So when we thought about DNA in the common ground, we were actually thinking about very, very common ground. But what we believed in was that as people involved in the visual world, we're very interested in kind of objects, things we like to touch. So when I think about details, I think very much about things that I like to handle. And so we thought if people put in those objects things that they were inspired by, we could set them out and start to see whether there was indeed a connection between the people with whom we felt a connection. And it was very, very interesting because some people indeed camouflaged their architecture. So Stephen Hole, who couldn't help himself, I think has architectural projects, but he took a kind of scrim and stretched it across the top. So all you see are these protrusions of potential projects. And other people really just sat at their desk and started to pick up things, I think, that belonged to them and put them in the box, and we ended up filling a vitrine. But I think what it brings us back to is this desire to have a kind of personal connection. So for me, detail has very much to do with a personal connection to a building.
I will say I will just say I've done the wrong thing. I've made details to just make a detail. I sinned, and I continue to sin. In some way to say, and certainly when I was younger more so, to say, I want to make this mark on this project, to say, I exist. Otherwise, you know, so I would like to talk about the issue of details should always be about relationship, the relationship of two people, the relationship of inside to outside. And where I really agree with Billie is that ultimately I think we need to relate to people. So the best details the most historic details are the prints of people's hands that are in caves throughout the world. The ancient prints say, I exist. And that's why I think that the best details will emerge when we back off from our ego and allow it to simply emerge through the act of constructing, allowing the building to talk for itself.
Well, I should say perhaps I trained as an architect, but I have to admit that detailing was not perhaps the thing I loved most as a student. So I feel a little strange being on a panel about details. But as we're here in Venice, of course, one thinks of obviously Scarpa, of Ruskin before him. And this problem, perhaps, that detailing becomes, as you said, a sort of a decoration, a kind of embellishment of some sort. In Scarpa, I always think of Jugendstil and Vienna and this kind of decorative feeling, for example. But I was also thinking, of course, about Palladio as we're here in Venice, and wondering, is there some connection to be made between detail and orders, and the idea of the possibility, perhaps, of thinking about detail as one might think about classification. I'm wondering, is that a way to think about making large buildings, and many buildings? Now, you're the expert perhaps here because of the Basel project, maybe perhaps you disagree, but the notion of refining a certain set of constructional realities into a kind of language. In the exhibition inside Toshiko, the pieces look, I'm sure it's deliberate, they feel very totemic to me. They have a kind of character about them, which I think comes, at least in part, from the language of the various geometries coming together in gravity, as you pointed out before. And so I'm curious to think about the, let's say, mid-20th century. Most of the projects that are inside that you are responding to as an architect are mid-20th century American-based projects, and thinking about somebody like Saarinen and John Dinkeloo at Saarinen's office, and taking materiality and construction processes and the detailing of these elements into a kind of language. I'm thinking of General Motors, for example, which I know Todd knows, I'm sure, very well. And then thinking about the more recent projects, and for example, the Zaha Hadid exhibition inside, where it's maybe another kind of fetish. It's I mean this in a good way, not in a bad way, but a concern for the skin. And I guess one could think here of detail and the way that people in America speak about detailing a car. It's a different kind of detail, right? It's an idea about a surface finish.
Smoothness.
A smoothness, yeah, and a kind of sexiness, which is also a very contemporary thing. And if many of Scarpa's projects are about the beautiful element that's selected by the architect.
Articulation, right.
Articulation.
Smoothness.
And if many of the more classical projects are about a kind of knuckle-like resolution, like the bones of the building coming together, maybe there is a new kind of emerging sense of detailing which has to do with new computer capabilities, both in terms of representation and manufacturing, which has a less focused, pinpointed, knuckle-like reality.
Bill, did you have a question?
Yeah, someone mentioned the strength of the concept and the imagery, and I felt that it was in a way of saying maybe this is a more important issue than the details themselves. And I keep getting drawn to this sort of fact of the world that we live in, where it seems like by ignoring those sort of connections and what can evolve from them, how those connections reinforce the concept of the whole, I have this feeling that we don't end up with sort of a modern mechanized arte povera, but what we really end up with is a manufactured production of the conceptual image, which is what the digital age seems to have brought us. So I wonder how all of you might feel about that, and if in fact the real connection of the hand has to be there. Does there have to be a hand-made aspect to this, or is this terribly archaic idea that there has to be a hand?
That's an excellent question. Would you like to take it?
Yeah, just to say, now it's computer people crazy focus on the computer design. In many university, you will see the student has a joke. Oh, our university is a full course about the philosophy and a full course about the computer. That's all. It's about architecture education. So on another side, I think it directly you can feel. If you join architecture by pencil, finally you'll find it's a pencil building. If you join by computer, directly can feel it's a computer building. Right? It's totally different, right? So for me, till now, I just use the pencil. I don't know how to use computer. Because I use the pencil, I directly, when I drawing on the paper, I get memory and imagination and touch my heart, touch my body feelings. I can hear the sound. I can feel the temperature. I can give the imagination about I go in the drawing. Yeah, so it's quite different about the computer drawings. So I think at least we should, like this world, they have many different lines. They can coexist together. And not just, computer is about future, so they can take down any other choice. I don't like that. We should like the different things. They can coexist together. It means amazing. Right, so I think, at least to me, I don't like computer at all.
I think, Vittorio, I think this is the end of a session now. I don't want to keep you forever, but your summary is quite elegant in the sense that details really, they have to embody certain complexity, and then it has to allow, it does confront failures, therefore it has to allow resilience, and then we as architects always confronting this fact that perhaps if we don't work through, it may fail. So there's certain sense of commitment that we make in detailing, working through something, but yet it's all embracing in terms of technical issues, also human experiences. So it's really, in a way, it's a moment that we confront our thoughts and the reality outside the world. And I thank you all very much for participating in this panel and from different parts of the world, different mindsets. So this was very productive discussion, and I wish we can keep talking, but I'm sure you want to go to parties and drinks and dinner. But thank you, and thank you very much for joining us today.